Welcome to the future. Get ready to explore how spirituality and science will come together in the age of Aquarius. Hosted by Jacy Nova.
Welcome to the Age of Aquarius podcast show. We are back and ready to explore the great unknown this season. Join us as we embark on a journey through the stars and delve into the mysteries of the universe. Today, I have a very special guest with us, Tom Shroder, who is a highly acclaimed author and journalist with over 3 decades of experience in the industry. Born in New York City in 1954, Tom is the son of a novelist and a builder, and the grandson of Pulitzer Prize-winning author McKinley Cantor. He attended the University of Florida, where he honed his writing skills as an editor of the student daily newspaper. Later, he joined the Washington Post, where he served as an editor and writer from 1999 to 2009, and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize twice for his feature writing. Tom is the author of several groundbreaking books, including Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal, which is a mind-altering account of the resurgent research into the medical use of psychedelic drugs. He is also the co-author of Fire on the Horizon, the untold story of the Gulf oil disaster, and the sole author of Old Souls, compelling evidence from children who remember past lives, a classic study of the border between science and mysticism. Today, he joins us to talk about his fascinating journey as an author and journalist, and shares his insights on some of the most captivating topics of our time. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Age of Aquarius. I'm Jacy Nova, and today I'm honored to welcome Tom Shroder. Thank you for being on the show, Tom.
It's my pleasure.
So I'm going to just dive right in. You have such an amazing career, and I want to just kind of talk about where you grew up and what inspired your interest in writing.
Oh, sure. Well, I was born in New York, in Scarsdale, northern suburb. And then when we were 14, we moved to Siesta Key, Florida, where my grandfather had lived since the 30s. He had a house on the beach. And at one time, he was a very well-known novelist. He won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, a Civil War book called Andersonville. You know, I didn't really realize this until much too late, but I never would have thought that that was why I wanted to be a writer. But, where there's smoke, there's fire. And it seems pretty obvious to me now that that did influence me, make me want to be a writer, because that's really all I ever wanted to do. And then one time, like in 7th grade, I wrote some poem that the teacher read to the class, and that suddenly made me think I could do it, even though it was probably a really crappy poem. I joined the college paper at the University of Florida, and that's where I sort of got into journalism.
What was the first book that you ever wrote?
I wrote a book with another guy named John Barry about a naturalist photographer named Clyde Butcher, who was to the Florida Everglades what Ansel Adams was to the sort of Mountain West. He had an interesting story because he had been a commercial photographer, and then his teenage son was killed by a drunk driver, which kind of drove him a little batty, and he kind of disappeared into the Everglades swamps and started taking only black and white pictures of swamps, which is sort of the antithesis of everything a commercial photographer has learned. He ended up taking these really gorgeous nature photographs with this huge old, sort of one of those big box cameras that are up on stilts. And so I went out into I spent a lot of time walking around in chest deep swamp water with him while he took his pictures, and wrote that book. And then after that, I got interested in this University of Virginia professor, a psychiatrist. He'd actually been the head of the university psychiatry department for a while, until he started getting obsessed with these cases of small children around the world. And there were reports of them sort of saying things that made it look like they were remembering previous lives. He ended up spending 30 years traveling around the world investigating these cases. And it took me 2 years, but I finally convinced him when he was 80 to let me come with him on some of his research trips to India and to Lebanon and then around the United States. And I wrote a book about that called Old Souls. And these cases were amazing, and the children were extremely convincing. They would say things about people that they didn't know, obviously, that the family had no connection to, that had died before they were born, and in some really small detail that turned out to be accurate in a lot of cases. And so he would go and he would get all the things that the child had said and done before they had ever known or met the families of the dead people that they seemed to be saying they were. And then he'd go and check it out and find that they knew amazing stuff. Like, you know, in one case, there was a boy who he thought he was this guy who had died in a town miles away years before he was born. And they took him to where this guy had lived. And he said, well, that's where I kept my rifles and my hunting rifles. And it was just a blank wall. And the house had been abandoned. So somebody that was with them took a little sledgehammer and smashed through the wall. And sure enough, there were some guns in there. So, I mean, things like that is really, really astonishing.
That's fascinating. And how did it change you being able to accompany Dr. Stevenson to these remote villages around the world? How did it impact you on a spiritual level?
I thought he was going to be a fraud or something. And immediately became clear that he just wanted to, find out what the reality was with these kids. And the kids were obviously not trying to defraud anyone. They didn't care if anybody believed them or not. And sometimes their families didn't want them to sort of be reincarnated. They just said they just wanted them to be their own kids. So in some cases, some skeptics had said, well, the parents just want attention, or, they want a book deal or something. Well, in India, these people in rural India aren't getting book deals. And in many cases, it was the opposite. They tried to suppress the kid from saying that. Like there was a case where a little girl who started saying as soon as she could talk, "You're not my real parents." I want to go see my real family. And the parents hit her for saying this. They thought, it was disrespectful. And so then a guy who milked their cows for them came by to do that. And the little girl runs out of the house and saying, "Please take me to see my real family." These people, meaning her parents, won't let me. So she said the name of her parents and what village they lived in. So this guy was really taken by it, the milkman, and he had a friend. He knew somebody who had lived in the town the little girl was talking about. So he told them the story, and they said, well, there are people with that name living in that village. And they had a daughter who got hit by a car and killed about 8-9 years ago. And this little girl was 7 at the time. So anyway, the word gets back to the family in this other town that this little girl was claiming to be their dead daughter, reincarnated. And they made a couple of the sort of elders of the town and came with the father and made a surprise visit to the little girl's house. And the little girl was out. And when she came in, they were all standing around and they said, "Show us who your father is." And she sort of went right to him and jumped up in his lap and hugged him and said, "Please take me home." So, it was filled with stories like that. And it seems less likely that there's a normal explanation for this than there's some explanation that, our current understanding can't quite explain. And I don't know what it is. The problem is that if you say, well, it's reincarnation, well, that's fine. That's an explanation. But what exactly is reincarnation? What is it that's being transferred from one body to another? And nobody has any sort of theories about what that thing is. Okay, you could say it's a soul, but what is a soul exactly? And is it detectable? If you're talking about religious belief, that's one thing. But if you're talking about science, which is really, my orientation, then you have to think, well, what more could you do to get an operational theory about what's going on here? And, so that's sort of where I got stuck. But, it makes you realize that, how little we really know about what reality consists of.
Do you feel like that perhaps if people were saying, no, I don't believe in reincarnation, could you say perhaps that memories are transferred? Like, I know that there are some tests that people have done, like say if you go to a haunted house and they're saying that, houses or rooms hold like energy from previous people that have lived there, or if, say something traumatic has happened. I'm just curious if Dr. Ian Stevenson went any farther to kind of say, okay, if you believe in reincarnation, here's the spiritual explanation. But from a scientific point of view, here's an explanation of why these children might have these memories.
He flirted around with ideas about, what it could possibly be, but he never really had anything that was testable. And of course, one of the main tenets of science is that you have to have something that can be tested and that can be proven false. I mean, if you have something, an idea that you can't disprove, then, you can't really call it science. I told him, one thing that is testable is that if you canvass a large group of people, you can predict and test whether you will find many cases that are just like this. And that is true. I mean, I run into people all the time who says their brother or cousin or, niece or nephew or something had an experience just like this, where they started saying, I used to be this person, or when I had children, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old rather would be saying, when I was a mommy and daddy, and then they start giving some details. That happens in this country as well. And more, you hear stories like this. There was a little American boy who started drawing these very elaborate images of World War II planes. And he started naming what the planes were and talking about the operation of the planes. And this is a little kid. And saying things that even his parents didn't know about. And then they checked it out and turned out that the kid was saying real things. He's naming real planes and talking about how they operated in a way that a normal person wouldn't even know, much less a kid. And he started giving names and saying that, he got shot down and naming place names and stuff. And all this turned out to relate to the life of a pilot in World War II. So there are other possibilities, that are even further out than that it made me sort of relate to, which is, that our whole perception of reality is maybe, not quite as solid as we think it is. That maybe to some degree, the world is an illusion created in our own minds, and all sorts of weird things can happen in that case. I've had some other experiences of things that seemed beyond coincidence and yet meaningful. These are events that are, called synchronicities, that seem like it's absolutely impossible that it's just a coincidence, and yet there's nothing that we understand that could explain how they happen. So I guess it opened me up to the possibility that there's, as Shakespeare said, there's, way more to reality than our poor imaginations can supply.
How has this affected your view on life and mortality?
It's interesting because, most of these kids, if they get to a certain age, they began to sort of forget things. And of course, the vast, vast majority of people don't have these memories. I think that if someone said, okay, you're for sure going to be reincarnated, but you're not going to remember anything about your previous life at all, it's just going to be like it never happened. Well, what difference would that make? It would be like it never happened, because, the thing that I value about my life is the whole experience of it and the story that it tells. And if that just disappears, you can say, well, you've been reincarnated. Well, how is that different than just dying? It's not that reassuring to me, to be honest. But on the other hand, I think it is reassuring to think that life is this absolutely spectacular and unfathomable mystery that is beyond any human comprehension, and that the only way to sort of regard it is with this unceasing awe. That's sort of where I'm at. I just find everything that we're learning about the universe and time and all the sort of amazing varieties and complexity of life on this planet, they're all just such a miracle by any slice of the imagination. And that sort of is what I focus on.
Do you think in the future that science will have a better idea of, obviously we're coming into the artificial intelligence and new technologies, and in a way spirituality and technology and science are all kind of colliding together? Do you think maybe 5 to 10 years from now we'll have a better understanding of perhaps intuitive abilities, reincarnation, synchronicity, any of these?
I do think that the understanding of the brain, and the sort of hard problem of what exactly is consciousness, as they're developing artificial intelligence that can begin to approach human consciousness, perhaps, I think we will learn a lot more about it. But I don't think that the world is ever going to stop being a mystery that there's no bottom to, and there's no way that we're ever going to understand everything. I think we're going to keep making strides, but I think that the world is always going to be more amazing than anything we can comprehend.
You wrote another book called Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal on psychedelics. Can you tell me a little bit more about that book?
Psychedelics were, in the 50s and 60s, they were the most studied drugs in the world. And the reason was that, there's been thousands of years of use of naturally occurring psychedelics in various cultures. It sort of really hit home with Western culture when LSD, a very powerful psychedelic, was accidentally discovered in the labs of Sandoz chemical company. And they sent this amazing drug out to universities and to psychiatrists and psychologists all over the world, saying, we found this drug with amazing psychoactive principles. What do you think we can do with it? Do you think it's useful in any way? And the first idea was that maybe it mimicked psychosis. And psychosis was and schizophrenia and major mental illnesses, they just had no way of treating them. None of the treatments that they had really helped much, and they didn't understand what it was. So here was this drug that on the surface, it looked like it recreated the symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. They gave them to a lot of grad students and such, and researchers took them themselves, and they said, wait a second, these are the most meaningful experiences of my life. I'm seeing the world in a whole different and more perceptive and better way after having had these experiences. I'm seeing myself as if, from a great height with new understanding and just these amazing insights. So they said, this doesn't really mimic major mental illness, but what it does is it allows us to change the way we see the world and ourselves in ways that make us healthier. And they started using it to help people with all sorts of mental health issues with enormous success, like drug addiction, alcoholism, all the way to people with bad marital relationships or people with depression and and autism. And for 2 decades, there was this thriving community of therapists who worked with these drugs and helped people get over all kinds of issues. And it wasn't like some other drugs that people get for mental health issues that just treat symptoms and have all these side effects. Rather, it gave people a chance to have an experience that really, there's no other word for it, cured them. They didn't have to keep doing it over and over again. They would do it and have this cathartic experience that got rid of the problem. And then they sort of went on with their life much healthier. And then, of course, the CIA started saying, well, maybe this would be a good interrogation drug. They thought contradictory things. They thought maybe we could use it to make people tell the truth. And then they thought, well, maybe we could give it to our agents to take if they were captured, so they were being capable of telling the truth. So it's crazy stuff. And because they were doing indiscriminate research with this, it sort of got out into, people like Ken Kesey were part of this CIA-funded research, and they had the same experience that the graduate students had originally and said, hey, this is really helping me see the world in a new and better way. And so it kind of got out as a public drug, as a recreational drug, and it sort of exploded among college students and hippies, et cetera. And it scared the crap out of all the authority figures in society. And so sort of led by the government, they went on this campaign to demonize this drug. And it became illegal. Not only did it become illegal, but they shut down all the research. And remember, this was the most studied drug in the world. They shut down all the research cold on its beneficial uses. That's the background for acid testing. And what happened was the small group of people who refused to give up on the promise of this drug waged this like decades-long campaign to prove that it was safe and effective and extremely beneficial. And there were some really amazing characters who were behind this. And so I focused on those characters and told the story of how they sort of battled all this government suppression and prejudice. And they are only now at the brink of making this a new revolution in psychiatry, where in like a few years, it's going to be legal to prescribe treatment using this drug in a therapeutic setting, or these drugs rather. And that's what the acid test is about.
How do you think once it is approved and is legal to use with patients in therapy, how do you think it'll impact science, culture, and politics as we know it? Will it just be another drug that someone might use to treat depression or PTSD or addiction, or will it have more of a life-changing effect on society?
Well, first of all, don't just dismiss the possibility of treating depression and PTSD and all these other really crippling mental health problems that hundreds of millions of people suffer from, not only in this country, but around the world. People whose lives are destroyed by these things. And this will help millions and millions of people. So, that'll have a huge change in our culture, especially, think of all the people who are being scarred now by, like, the war in Ukraine, for instance, or the wars in the Middle East, or the millions of women who are raped or the victims of sexual abuse. And, like 50% of women who experience rape end up with PTSD, which is something that can cripple them for the rest of their lives and make their lives miserable and unproductive. And all these veterans of combat that, of these decade-long wars that we fought, who come home with, like there's something like, there's a dispute of whether it's like 12 or 20% of combat veterans who come home with this. That will make a huge difference in our world of not only allowing people to live satisfying, productive lives, millions of people who otherwise wouldn't. able to contribute to our economy, to our culture, et cetera. That in itself is a society-changing result. But in addition, it sort of will become more understood that these experiences that people have with these drugs can also, they did at Johns Hopkins, they did these clinical trials where they gave psilocybin to completely healthy, high-functioning, mentally secure adults, and a huge proportion of them called them either one of the 10 most important experiences of their lives or the most important experience of their lives. And what that does is it tends to allow people to become more empathetic, more understanding, less anger issues, less violence. It could have a huge effect. And of course, Rick Doblin, who is the head of the nonprofit that's making all this happen, believes that it could lead to world peace. I mean, he thinks big, and he thinks that, for us to sort of appreciate our environment and to make the sacrifices and the moves necessary to take care of the world and of each other, that's what he thinks is where it's headed. And it certainly will help people sort of look in that direction anyway.
What are some of the obstacles stopping it from being approved right now? Is it just going through the normal process that any drug has to go through to get approved?
Yeah, for years, there were artificial obstacles that the government put up. Like the DAA wouldn't approve it for research purposes, even though it was perfectly safe. They made ridiculous requirements about, keeping these drugs in all sorts of, like as if they were the Hope Diamond or something, when people could go get it on the street. At first, research was banned altogether. If anybody at a university or a research institute expressed interest in it, they basically were risking their entire career. So there was this whole kind of culture of really radical suppression of any interest in researching this seriously. The government spent millions of dollars researching psychedelics, but they weren't researching their benefits. They were desperately trying to find evidence that these were damaging drugs. And a researcher that they paid millions and millions of dollars sort of came up with that proof. He said, look, this is like I've been giving this to my chimps and it's killing them. That stopped this research cold for a couple of years until it came out that he hadn't given his chimps the psychedelics. Instead, he'd given them methamphetamine, and that the bottles had been mislabeled. And they had to run these huge retractions. And the irony, of course, was that methamphetamine was a drug you could prescribe. The drug that was so dangerous was killing his monkeys was something that had been approved for prescription, whereas the psychedelics, which were remarkably safe considering how powerful they are in their effects, were just held out as being these sort of incredibly dangerous drugs.
Do you think that it's possible that they don't want it to be approved because all people that are suffering, whether it's veterans from war, PTSD, or the homeless or anything, it's like, to me, sometimes I feel like the homelessness crisis is big business, and it feels like people are spent throwing money at it, but they don't want to really fix it. Do you think there's a possibility that there's a conflict of interest where they're like, well, if we empower people and they get better, then we have less control over them?
I don't think it's anything that's sort of overtly evil. There are a couple of problems. One is that these drugs are all generic. They're not patentable. So that there's not like this gigantic gold mine to be made that you can make if you come up with a new drug that you create and that you can have a patent on. So that's why the big pharmaceutical companies weren't interested in this, because they couldn't make billions of dollars on it. And that's why it took this nonprofit who's raising money on like Kickstarter programs and stuff originally, like $100 at a time, to go through this whole FDA process cost millions, tens of millions, and even hundreds of millions of dollars. as it's developed now, they've managed to raise an enormous amount of money for a nonprofit. But, it's a fraction of what a drug company would be spending on a new drug. So there's that issue. And then there's this sort of more complicated issue of people being afraid of the sort of liberating type of worldview that psychedelics sort of gives to people. People who are sort of thinking that everything needs to be repressed and buttoned down, and that seeing the world as a mystical place is threatening to them, and sort of like maybe it's a threat to their religious views, or it's a threat to their idea of like control and discipline. And that's more subtle, but I do think that there is certainly an authoritarian strain in our society that finds the whole kind of liberating worldview that psychedelics tend to induce as being threatening.
It kind of makes me think of part of the inspiration behind the podcast of Age of Aquarius is it allows people to explore and free thinking and be more spiritual and more conscious about how we approach life. I'm just curious, what does Age of Aquarius mean to you?
I think that what you described is what I think of when I hear that term. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that this idea of people experiencing the world for themselves directly and the mysteries of the world for themselves directly, and not simply taking people's word for it and sort of following the strictures of their ancestors that have been written down in books for hundreds of years, that some people feel that that's threatening to them. They don't want people to sort of be their own evaluators of reality. They want to tell people how it is and have them listen. So yeah, I do think that whole idea of liberation and of seeing the world in a fresh and inspired way rubs some people and groups of people the wrong way.
I think what I've found inspiring with the tragedy of what's going on in Ukraine, but President Zelensky has become such an inspiration around the world for leadership and a love of his country and trying to stand up for what he believes is right, and that the world is kind of coming together to support him in different ways. I almost sense like there is a shift after we've had the pandemic. Some of us, I guess, we're kind of still in it or out of it. It's hard to say. Are you hopeful that the world is going to be more empathetic after what we've experienced over the last 2 years and what we're experiencing right now?
Well, there's so much to be concerned about in the world now. Between here we have this threat of planet-crushing climate crisis, and instead of rallying around the solutions for it, and there are a lot of solutions for it, we're like invading smaller countries and bombing their cities and obliterating them. We had this disease that was killing millions of people around the world. And then we had this incredible technical achievement, the scientific achievement of coming up with a vaccine that could really make us pretty much invulnerable to the worst outcomes of this thing. And so what happens? Half the country decides that the vaccine is the problem. I mean, it just drives you crazy. But the world has been in a lot of tough places. And, here we are, and there's still so much beauty and so many good things in the world and so many good people who really care about others and care about the world and are doing their best to sort of make things better. So I think you need to bet on the hopeful aspect rather than focus on the negative, because, we've come through a lot of bad stuff before. I think you got to just have some faith.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have noticed over the last couple of years being able to reconnect with old friends, people that I went to school with when I was younger, and trying to reconnect with people that maybe I've lost touch with. And so for myself on a personal level, I've found that incredibly meaningful and kind of rediscovering a part of myself that maybe I had this one friend, Lisa, that I went to grade school and junior high with and part of high school, and being able to reconnect with her after like 25 years and sitting down and talking with her, it almost gave me this sense of like being the last time I saw her, I think I was maybe 15, and feeling like that all over again. Like we were friends. It's like nothing had changed. And even though her and I live completely different lifestyles, she's a nurse and she's married to a teacher and she has 6 children. She just has this really different lifestyle that I have. We still have that really great emotional connection with each other. And I'm finding that a lot of people, because of the pandemic, we weren't able to connect with each other in person. And I'm just wondering how you see the world differently now after experiencing the pandemic. And because you're a writer and you're a storyteller, what are you hearing from other people that share their life stories with you?
I think there are a lot of people that have had similar experiences where, as awful as so much of the pandemic was, it made them realize how important their personal, intimate connections were. There were all sorts of people that I really never was in contact with. And everybody getting on Zoom all the time, made you start having like these book clubs on Zoom and catching up with your old friends on Zoom and relatives that live across the country. A lot of people have, as you mentioned, have been brought closer by this. And I also think that it sort of made us realize that the fragility of our sense of security and well-being, and that we can't really take it for granted, and we have to sort of proactively go out there and live our lives and value the experiences that we have and the connections we have with other people. I do think that kind of thinking, the thinking of what's really important in my life and what do I need to do to sort of make that thrive and grow, I think that will carry on and will sort of help us in the future.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're focusing on now? Are you working on any new books or new projects that you'd want to talk about?
I also do book editing, and I've just finished editing a book that's going to come out at the end of the summer about the incredible journey of Black players in the NFL, and this, in particular, Black quarterbacks, because the amount of prejudice that prevented Black athletes from participating in the NFL in the beginning, they were explicitly banned for years. Even when a majority of NFL players were African American, they still weren't allowed to be quarterback because people had these incredibly racist ideas. Oh, they can't be leaders, or they don't play with enough discipline, completely bogus stuff. And there are these incredibly gifted Black athletes who wanted to be quarterbacks who had to go be defensive ends or whatever. And now we're at a point, finally, where the marquee players in the NFL are these Black quarterbacks. And they're not only, the face of the league and the people who are bringing in the new fans, but they're taking stands on social issues, and they're making tremendous impact because this is a country that's obsessed with the National Football League and obsessed with football. And when the heroes of the league are these Black athletes who are saying, hey, we need to look at the deep roots of racism in our society, that has a huge impact. So I think that's a really interesting project. I really was glad to be a part of that. The book's called The Rise of the Black Quarterback, and it's coming out in either August or September. And then another book that I've been helping edit is a book about how the Georgetown University, which was a Jesuit university that had its roots in the when the country was just sort of founded and growing, that they basically got their campus through the work of, they owned slaves, they owned plantations in Maryland with hundreds of enslaved men and women on it. And then when they needed to sort of expand their campus, they sold these people, down south, splitting up families, selling, in some cases, children alone by themselves, splitting up husbands and wives, sending them into conditions where many people suffered and died. And they had never acknowledged that until just very recently. So this book actually tells the story of some enslaved men and women families that were broken up and sold, and sort of follows and what happened to them. And that's also an amazing book. So, I've been very happy to be working on those books. And, my own writing, I actually have a television pilot that's sort of trying to, outdoing the whole Hollywood thing of being shown around to streaming services, et cetera. And that's a very different experience that I've had, but I just kind of came across a story that appealed to me. So I tried my hand at it.
Do you write like every day, or do you write every week? Is there like a process that you follow when you're either working on a project or thinking about writing a book? I'm sure that some listeners are going to be interested to hear about what your creative process is.
I'm in a very lucky position because I've got this really pretty house in a pretty neighborhood and a porch that I go sit out on with my PC. I'm able to like work out and play tennis, and then I come in and maybe I'll spend like 4 or 5 hours trying to write something or working on something that I have. And usually when I'm writing, what I do is I'm constantly rewriting it, because I'll get something down, and then the next day the first thing I'll do is I'll go back through everything I have written so far. And every time I do that, I add another layer. I kind of find new meaning in it, or other ways to expand it, or ways to change it and make it better. Plus, doing that is a lot easier than when I start breaking new ground and forging ahead, which, just seems like you're trying to carry a heavy, like a diesel train with a, strap on your back or something. So going back over the work of the previous days and weeks lets you build a little momentum, and you start feeling good about it. It's just not so hard. That really helps.
When I'm writing, I try to set a couple of hours a day. I'm not able to every day.
And do you go back over what you'd written previously first?
Oh, yeah. I rewrite it over and over again, because it's kind of a stream of consciousness and trying to tell a story. But then, especially because we're working on a true crime project, as you find out more about the story, like you write the story based on the information you have, and then new information comes in, and then you have to add another layer, or perhaps it kind of changes the way I might have thought about what actually happened. So that's
and
really
also,
interesting.
Have you noticed that when you're writing, you start reaching for facts that you don't have. So that tells you, okay, this is what I need to find out. Maybe you're writing a scene or something, and then suddenly you're trying to describe somebody, and you realize, I don't know enough about this person. I need to find out more. That's the other thing that happens. Sitting down and trying to write something is one of the best ways to discover what you don't know, but you need to know.
That's a very good writing tip. That is very true. Any words of encouragement for other people out there in their creative process? That is a really good tip that you just gave, but I'm curious if there's anything else that you could say to encourage others, because you've had such an amazing career.
Well, I think the best thing to do is just to not worry so much about the quality of when you're sitting down to write. I used to have a sign over my desk that said, "Don't write, type." The idea being, just get started, start putting anything down. Then when you start going back through it, then you can start to shape it. It's sort of like Michelangelo trying to come up with David without having a big lump of marble in front of him. You have to have that lump of marble first. And then once you get the lump of marble, it doesn't really matter what shape that marble is, because you start to shape it. The same thing's true with writing. It almost doesn't matter what your first draft is. All first drafts suck. Just accept that and just keep typing. Whatever happens, keep typing. And then you can go back and start to see what's there. Writing is, in some ways, more an act of discovery than it is an act of creation. You're kind of just throwing stuff out there, and then you're discovering what's the value of it and what its potential is, where you can go with it.
That's fascinating. It's been so amazing to talk with you, Tom. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work? Where can they
I have a website that's tomshroder.com, TOMSHRODER.com. That pretty much sums up my career and what I've done and what I do. So that's probably a good place to go.
Well, I will also include a link to your website and some of your books in the show notes. Thank you so much, Tom, for being on the show today and sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
You just heard the Age of Aquarius podcast with your host, Jacy Nova. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming platform. Thanks for tuning in.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Age of Aquarius. If you did, make sure to follow and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform so you never miss another episode. Until next time, keep curious in your travels through the cosmos. I'm Jacy Nova. Thanks for listening.